Thomas Miller had been coming to the community center for 3 months. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he'd shuffle in wearing that red jacket over a faded t-shirt, white hair neatly combed, beard trimmed close. He was around 70, maybe older, and he carried himself with a quietness that most people mistook for weakness. The younger members barely noticed him. When they did, it was with sideways glances, whispered jokes about the old guy who probably got lost looking for the bingo hall. Thomas never responded. He'd find his spot in the back corner, stretch slowly, methodically, and watch the classes with those serious, sad eyes that seemed to hold stories nobody asked about. The gym itself was nothing fancy. Worn mats covered the floor, mirrors lined one wall, and the smell of sweat and disinfectant hung in the air. It was the kind of place where people came to prove something, mostly to themselves. The Tuesday evening mixed martial arts class drew a crowd, young men and women eager to learn throws, holds, submission techniques. They paid good money for it too, and the instructor made sure they knew he was worth every dollar. Jake Thornton ran the class with an iron fist and an ego to match. Mid-30s, built like he spent every free moment in the gym, which he probably did. He had the walk, the talk, the attitude of someone who'd never really been humbled. His credentials were plastered on the wall behind the front desk, certificates from various martial arts schools, photos of him at tournaments, holding trophies, flexing for the camera. He wasn't shy about reminding everyone that he'd trained with some of the best, that he'd competed at high levels, that his technique was flawless. Most of the students ate it up, nodding along, trying to impress him with their dedication. But Jake had a mean streak. He didn't just teach, he dominated. If someone questioned a technique, he'd embarrass them in front of the class. If someone struggled, he'd make an example of them. And if someone didn't show him what he considered proper respect, he'd find ways to put them in their place. The community center management had received a few complaints, but Jake brought in money, kept the classes full, and he always had an explanation that made him sound reasonable after the fact. Thomas had witnessed it all from his corner. He'd seen Jake belittle a young woman who couldn't quite get a hip throw right, mocking her balance in front of everyone until tears welled in her eyes. He'd watched Jake deliberately crank an armbar too hard on a teenager who'd had the audacity to tap out too slowly for his liking. Thomas's jaw would tighten, his hands would curl slightly, but he never said anything. He just watched with that serious, sad expression, like he was seeing something that disappointed him deeply but wasn't surprised by it anymore. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday evening in late summer. The class was packed, maybe 25 people on the mats, and Jake was in rare form. He'd spent the first 20 minutes demonstrating a series of takedowns, each one executed with unnecessary force on his assistant, a younger guy named Marcus, who knew better than to complain. Then Jake opened it up for sparring, pairing people off, walking between them, correcting technique with sharp words and sharper demonstrations. Thomas was stretching in his usual spot when Jake's voice boomed across the gym. "Hey, old-timer, you just gonna sit there all night, or you actually planning to participate for once?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to the corner where Thomas sat, one leg extended, hands resting on his knee. He looked up slowly, meeting Jake's eyes with that steady, sad gaze. "I'm fine here, thank you," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the space. Jake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "You're fine there. Right. You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you come here, watch us real martial artists work, and you're too afraid to actually step on the mat because you know you can't hang." A few nervous laughs rippled through the students. Thomas didn't respond. He just held Jake's gaze, something unreadable flickering behind those serious eyes. Jake wasn't done. He strutted over, standing above Thomas, looking down with undisguised contempt. 3 months you've been taking up space in my gym. 3 months of watching, stretching, pretending you're part of something. You're not. You're just an old man who probably thinks he was tough once, back in whatever century you grew up in. This is a real gym. We do real work here. If you can't contribute, maybe you should find somewhere else to spend your evenings. Thomas slowly stood up. Even at 70, he was still solid, shoulders broad under that red jacket, though age had stooped them slightly. He was maybe an inch shorter than Jake, but something about the way he carried himself made the difference seem larger. "I don't want any trouble," Thomas said softly. "I paid my membership like everyone else. I'm just here to stay active." Jake stepped closer, invading his space. "Stay active? You barely move. Tell you what, old man, since you've been watching so carefully, why don't you show us what you've learned? Step on the mat with me. Let's see if all that observation paid off. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the people who'd been sparring had stopped, sensing something was about to happen. Thomas shook his head slightly. That's not necessary. Jake's smile turned cruel. I think it is. In fact, I'm making it a requirement. You want to keep coming to my class, you step on that mat right now and show me you belong here. Otherwise, I'm asking management to revoke your membership. You're a distraction, and you're making my other students uncomfortable. That wasn't true, and everyone knew it, but nobody spoke up. Thomas stood there for a long moment, those sad eyes studying Jake's face like he was looking at something tragic. Finally, he nodded once. All right, he said quietly. He shrugged off the red jacket, folding it carefully and setting it on the bench behind him. Underneath, his t-shirt was plain white, worn soft with age. His arms, while aged, still showed definition, the kind that comes from a lifetime of real work, not just gym sessions. He stepped onto the mat in his worn sneakers, moving with a deliberate slowness that Jake immediately mocked. Look at him, folks, real intimidating, right? Jake circled Thomas like a predator, hands up in a fighting stance, bouncing on his toes. I'll make this easy for you, Grandpa. You get one free shot. Take your best swing. Then I'll show everyone here what happens when you step into a real fighter's space. Thomas didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, weight balanced, watching Jake circle. His expression hadn't changed. Still that same serious, sad look like he was attending a funeral for something that used to matter. Jake's smile faded slightly. He didn't like being ignored. What's wrong? Scared now that you're actually here? Second thoughts? Thomas spoke so quietly that people leaned in to hear. I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this. Jake laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. Walk away? Old man, I'm going to put you down so fast you'll wish you'd stayed in your corner. Last chance to back out before you get hurt? Thomas's eyes flickered with something then, just for a second. Sadness, maybe, or pity. I meant, I'm giving you the chance to walk away, he said, slightly louder now. That did it. Jake's face flushed red. Nobody here can put me on the mat, he barked, loud enough that his voice bounced off every wall. You hear me? Nobody in this room, and especially not you, Grandpa. I'm a trained professional. I've studied under masters. I've competed at levels you can't even imagine. You're just an old man who doesn't know when to quit. He moved in fast then, reaching for Thomas's collar, probably planning some dramatic throw that would end this embarrassment quickly. 4 seconds. That's all it took. Thomas's movement was so economical, so precise, that most people didn't even see it happen. One moment Jake was reaching, the next his wrist was caught, redirected, his balance broken. Thomas pivoted, used Jake's own momentum against him, and suddenly Jake was airborne. Not thrown wildly, but controlled, guided, and then released. He hit the mat flat on his back with a sound that drove the air from his lungs. The impact wasn't brutal, but it was definitive. Jake lay there, stunned, staring at the ceiling, his brain trying to catch up with what his body had just experienced. The gym erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Thomas stood over Jake, not gloating, not celebrating, just looking down with that same sad expression. He extended a hand to help Jake up. Jake stared at it like it was a snake, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and then anger. He slapped the hand away and scrambled to his feet on his own, breathing hard. Lucky shot, he spat. You caught me off guard. Again. We go again right now. Thomas shook his head. No need. But Jake was already coming at him, this time with no technique, just anger and wounded pride. He threw a wild punch that Thomas slipped easily, then tried to tackle him low. Thomas sidestepped, used Jake's momentum again, and this time Jake went down even harder, his shoulder hitting first, his head snapping to the side. The second impact seemed to knock some sense into him because he stayed down longer this time, breathing hard, staring at the mat. The door at the front of the gym opened, and Colonel Richard Hayes walked in. He was in his mid-50s, wearing his dress uniform, ribbons and medals across his chest catching the light. He'd been driving past, seen the community center, remembered Thomas mentioning he came here, thought he'd stop in and say hello. Instead, he walked into a silent gym, everyone frozen, staring at an old man in a white t-shirt standing over a younger guy sprawled on the mat. What's going on here? Hayes asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. Thomas turned, and for the first time that evening, something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "Richard, wasn't expecting you." Hayes walked onto the mat, his eyes taking in the scene, the way everyone was staring, the way the guy on the ground looked equal parts angry and humiliated. "Thomas, you all right? This some kind of class exercise?" Jake pushed himself up to his knees, looking at the uniform, the rank insignia, the way this officer knew the old man's name. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Hayes looked at him like he was noticing an insect. "Colonel Richard Hayes, United States Army. And you are?" Jake stood up fully now, trying to regain some composure. "Jake Thornton. I run this gym. This is my class." Hayes nodded slowly. "Your class, I see, and you thought it was appropriate to go after a man twice your age?" Jake's face flushed again. "He's a student. He stepped on the mat. I was just demonstrating technique." "Demonstrating technique." Hayes repeated the words like they tasted bad. He turned to Thomas. "That what happened?" Thomas shrugged slightly. "Something like that." Hayes studied his old friend's face, seeing things there that the others couldn't, reading the situation in the way only someone who'd served alongside someone could. He turned back to Jake. "You have any idea who this man is?" Jake crossed his arms defensively. "Some old guy who comes here to watch. Look, I don't know what your relationship is, but this is my gym and I decide who trains here." "Your gym," Hayes said quietly, dangerously. "Let me tell you about this old guy. Thomas Miller, Master Sergeant, United States Army Rangers, 28 years of service, 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan. He's trained more soldiers in hand-to-hand combat than you've probably met in your entire life. He's got more confirmed enemy kills than you have tournament trophies. He holds black belts in 3 different martial arts earned when you were still in diapers. He's trained special forces operators, taught at Fort Benning, and written sections of the Army's current combatives manual, and you just tried to embarrass him in front of a room full of people." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the gym was on Thomas now, seeing him completely differently. The sad, serious expression made sense suddenly. This wasn't weakness or timidity. This was a man who'd seen real violence, real combat, and had no interest in proving anything to anyone because he had nothing left to prove. Jake's face had gone pale. "I didn't know," he stammered. "He never said anything. He just sat there." "He sat there because he's a professional," Hayes said sharply. "Because unlike you, he doesn't need to broadcast his credentials to feel important. He came here to stay active, to be around people. Maybe to remember what it felt like to be part of something before the VA appointments and the empty house got too heavy, and you mocked him, you belittled him, you forced him onto that mat to humiliate him in front of everyone." Hayes stepped closer to Jake. "Let me ask you something. How long did it take him to put you down?" Jake swallowed hard. "I don't know. It was fast." 4 seconds, someone called out from the crowd, a young guy who'd been watching, phone in hand. "I was recording. 4 seconds from contact to the first takedown, 3 for the second." Hayes nodded. 4 seconds. A trained professional martial arts instructor in his prime and a 70-year-old veteran put you on your back in 4 seconds. Twice. What does that tell you? Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire identity, everything he'd built his reputation on, had just been dismantled in front of his students. Thomas finally spoke, his voice still quiet, but carrying now. "Colonel, that's enough. He didn't know. Most people don't." He looked at Jake and there was no triumph in his eyes, just that same sadness. "You're a good instructor for what you teach. You know the techniques. You're strong. You're fast. But there's a difference between sport fighting and what I learned, what I had to use. You train people for competition, for rules, for tapping out. I trained people to survive when there were no rules. That's not better or worse. It's just different." Jake's voice came out hoarse. "Why didn't you say anything? All this time you just let us think you were nobody." Thomas picked up his red jacket, shrugging it back on slowly. "Because I am nobody. Not anymore. I'm just an old man trying to fill his evenings. The person I was, the things I did, they don't matter much outside of memory. I wasn't here to teach or to prove anything. I just wanted to be around people, watch them learn, Remember what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself. Hayes put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You're not nobody. Not to the men you trained, not to the soldiers who came home because of what you taught them, not to me. Thomas nodded, but the sadness didn't leave his eyes. I know, Richard, I know. He turned to face the class, all those young faces staring at him with new understanding, new respect. I'm sorry for the disruption. This wasn't what I wanted. A young woman stepped forward, the same one Jake had mocked weeks earlier. Sir, would you teach us? I mean, not take over the class, but maybe show us some of what you know? Others nodded, murmuring agreement. Thomas looked surprised, then uncomfortable. I don't know if that's appropriate. This is Jake's class. Jake, to his credit, had been doing some thinking in the last few minutes. His ego was bruised, maybe permanently, but he wasn't stupid. He could see the way his students were looking at Thomas, the respect and curiosity there. He could keep fighting it, keep his pride, and probably lose half his class, or he could make a different choice. I'd be honored if you'd share some of your knowledge, Jake said, the words clearly difficult but genuine. I was wrong. About you, about how I treated you, about a lot of things. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then he nodded once. All right, but not tonight. Tonight I think we've all had enough excitement. He looked at Hayes. Buy you a coffee? Hayes smiled. Absolutely. As they walked toward the door, students parted to let them through, several reaching out to shake Thomas's hand, to thank him, to apologize for their own dismissive attitudes. Thomas accepted it all with quiet grace, that serious expression never quite breaking into a smile, but something in his eyes suggesting he was touched by the gesture. At the door, he paused and turned back. One thing, he said, his voice carrying across the gym. What happened here tonight, it's not about me being better than anyone. It's about respect, real respect, not the kind you demand, but the kind you earn by how you treat people, especially when you think they can't do anything for you. Every person in this room has value. Every person has a story. You don't know what someone's been through, what they've survived, what they're carrying. So treat everyone like they matter, because they do. The gym was quiet as Thomas and Hayes left. Jake stood in the middle of the mat, his students looking at him expectantly. He took a deep breath. All right, everyone. I think we all learned something tonight. And I think I need to learn the most. Class dismissed. Next session, we're going to talk about respect and discipline before we touch any technique. As people filed out, talking in excited whispers about what they'd witnessed, Jake sat down on the bench where Thomas used to sit in the corner. He noticed something there, a worn photograph that must have fallen from the old man's jacket. He picked it up carefully. It showed a much younger Thomas, maybe 30, in combat fatigues, surrounded by a group of soldiers. They were all smiling, arms around each other, the camaraderie obvious even across the decades. On the back, written in faded ink, Training Cadre, Fort Benning, 1985. The Men Who Teach Warriors. Jake stared at it for a long time, then carefully tucked it into his pocket. He'd return it next week. And maybe, if Thomas was willing, he'd ask to hear some of those stories. Not the combat ones necessarily, but the ones about what it meant to be a real teacher, a real leader, someone who built people up instead of tearing them down. Thomas Miller came back the following Tuesday, wearing his red jacket and that same serious, sad expression. But this time, when he walked in, the entire class stopped and applauded. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he nodded his thanks and made his way to his corner. Except it wasn't just his corner anymore. Jake had put a chair there, a good one, with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for Master Sergeant Miller." And for the next hour, Thomas sat in that chair and watched Jake teach, occasionally nodding approval, once or twice shaking his head slightly when technique got sloppy. And when Jake asked him at the end if he'd demonstrate a proper hip throw, Thomas stood up, stepped onto the mat, and taught. Not with arrogance or showmanship, but with patience and precision and the kind of quiet authority that can only come from decades of real experience. The students watched in reverent silence, absorbing every word, every movement, understanding that they were in the presence of something rare and valuable. A true master who'd never needed to announce himself because his actions spoke louder than any words ever could.